Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading true, scary railroad stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. Back when my dad was a freight train driver, he had to stop at a red light in a wooded area in the middle of nowhere. The guard of the train, who's usually at the back of the train, radioed to tell him that it's going to take a while. So Dad got off his cabin to take a leak. As he was watering the bushes, he saw a relatively well-dressed man approaching him, and he asked my dad to give him a lift to the nearest station. This man had a backpack and for some reason an axe. Dad decided to give him a lift and asked him to take a seat in the cabin. All throughout the 2-hour journey to the next station, the man didn't put down his backpack or his axe. He was eyeing him constantly through the corner of his eye and read a manic expression that you absolutely don't get from a lumberjack who had gotten off of work at 2 a.m. After dropping off the man, the guard and my dad notified the cops and gave them the man's description. A month or so later, the department was issued a notice to not give lifts to strangers, as the man that they had picked up was a gang member and had just shot a man and buried him in pieces in that general vicinity. Rolling through the Atchafalaya River Basin, about 1:30 in the morning, nothing but uninhabitable swamp for miles. We're running on reds at restricted speed, no crossings or anything to worry about, so the conductor and I are naturally in and out. I look up at one point and see these 3 white lights moving in circular motions as if they're floating across the tracks. I think to myself, what the heck is that? And wipe the sleep from my eyes. But it's still there. My conductor then asks me, "You see those lights too, right?" I said I dang sure do. I thought I was seeing stuff. He said, "Let's slow down to about 5 and see if we see anything." We get up to the spot where the lights are, and of course, nothing. We shined our flashlights into the swamp but don't see anything. No clue what it could have been. But I know that there's no way that there were 3 people out there walking around in the swamp at 1:30 in the morning. I'm a conductor. This story happened at 3 a.m. I was going 50 miles per hour and had 15,000 tons behind me. I was approaching a closed overhead pedestrian bridge. It's not uncommon to see kids stop and watch a train go by. This night, there are 4 people on the bridge. As I get closer, I see them bending over, standing up, waving their arms, etc. I know something isn't right. I blow the horn a few times and ring the bell. Then, I see a person on the railing, and then drop and stop mid-fall. There's a rope around the body, and I catch the body at windshield height. They've done thrown a clothed mannequin off the bridge. Backstory: a few months earlier, a guy had murdered his girlfriend and then threw her off the same bridge as I went by. He thought the train would destroy her body and whatever evidence there was. People suck. I got hit by the hotbox detector on a really cold night after midnight. We were stopped at the bottom of the steepest hill on our sub. There was an ice crust on top of the snow, so every step was crunchy. I walked back, I think about 20 cars, and found nothing. I did my due diligence, checking back a few cars, and was making my way back to the head end. About 7 or 8 cars from the head end, I start hearing a second set of footsteps, a little behind me and to the right. At first I thought it might be an echo, but this is the middle of farm fields and prairie. There's nothing for sound to echo off of, and these sounded like crisp, clear steps about 10 feet away. Something I'm used to hearing after working outside most of my life. After a couple of steps, I stopped, and the footsteps stopped as well. I continued, and half a beat later, so do they. I stopped and they did again. I'd begin walking and same thing, about half a step off of mine. I paused one last time, and heard a single step after my feet stopped. I noped right along, climbed on the rear engine, and walked through the power rather than on the right-of-way. A couple of years later, I was getting back into photography, hiking and local history. While researching an 1800s brick pump house I had found in the nearby city, I ended up going down an old newspaper rabbit hole. I somehow stumbled across an article from the late 1800s about a locomotive whose boilers exploded near where I heard those footsteps. The engineer, a Civil War veteran, and I think the firemen were both killed. I wish I could find that article again. It really bothers me to this day. This dates back a couple of decades to a time when trains had slam door carriages. But here you go. I'm traveling in such a carriage, commuting home. It's a warm summer's evening. Everyone is dozing. We're approaching one of the more busy stations on our tiny single-track branch line, where you can change to another line, when we stopped quite sharply at a red signal about 100 yards before the platform. The jolt woke up the guy opposite me. He blinked and stared around owlishly, obviously figuring that we were at the station, jumped up with his briefcase, opened the door, and walked out. Whoosh, straight down to the track. The rest of us were temporarily stunned. Before we could react, a briefcase came winging its way into the carriage, and 2 hands appeared on the floor of the doorway as the unfortunate bloke clambered back in. No one helped him. We were all being very British, pretending that we hadn't seen what had happened. In our defense, I think we just felt embarrassed for him. However, we were not prepared for what happened next. The chap obviously figured he'd been an idiot and had used the door on the wrong side of the carriage by mistake. So he picked up his briefcase, wandered across the aisle, and in front of our disbelieving eyes opened the other door and walked out. Whoosh again. Yet again, a briefcase flew into the carriage as the poor bloke levered himself back on board. We couldn't have helped him this time, even if we wanted to. All of us were crying and helpless with laughter. I work as a backup janitor when the normal one isn't available. I've seen some very weird things at the places I've cleaned. There's the usual needles and beer cans. Not that shocking after a while. But the weirdest thing I have ever seen was when I was called out to a train yard to clean out some diffused engines. These things hadn't been used since the mid-90s and were going to be sold for scrap as they were too battered to be refurbished. I was warned beforehand that there might be a bum in one of them, but I brushed it off since I had seen many bums at the various places I cleaned. They usually just ran off when they saw me coming. So I picked up my bucket and got in the company truck to go out to the disused part of the yard where the trains were, routine janitorial duties. As I'm driving out there, I noticed that I had left the keys to the trains back at the office. Oh well, I figure. These things are so old that the door might not even be there anymore. So I drive out to the engines and park my truck and get out. Nothing is creepy at this point, just some rotting diesel engines. I had seen much more creepy things before. I walk up the railing and kick in the door with little force. It didn't even lock anymore. I walk in and I immediately notice something very odd. It's in near mint condition. Great, I think. One less room to clean. But then I notice something very, very disturbing. A skeleton perched against a wall. Then I notice that it's wearing a leather jacket and clutching a pill bottle in its bony hands. It was a self-unaliving. I walk a bit closer and grab the pill bottle from its hand. The prescription date was 10/9/1996. Over 10 years ago, this guy had been rotting in a train for 10 years and nobody noticed his absence. I pressed the button on my radio and told the guard to call the cops. There's a dead guy in here and he's been here for a decade. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulls up, and an off-duty cop steps up and walks up to the train. Turns out that this man has been missing since 1997, and nobody even cared enough to look for him. He was an elderly man who lost his wife and offed himself in a train. He laid there for 11 years and was never disturbed. When they buried him a few days later, I was the only one to come. All of his family were dead, or didn't care enough to come. Very sad, and very creepy. Conductor here. One time in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, 10 degrees and a foot of snow on the ground, my train went into emergency. I had to walk the length of the train to see what the problem was. The train was right in the middle of a very small town. As I'm walking by one of the houses on the outskirts of this town, I see a guy standing in the driveway about 50 feet from me, wearing a trench coat and a sock hat type thing. The first thing that struck me as odd is that it was way too cold to be wearing just a trench coat. I shine my lantern on the guy, wave and say hi. Nothing. The guy doesn't even move. I continue walking past the guy to the end of the train while looking back very often. I get to the end, turn around and head back. I get back to the house where this guy is standing, and he's still there in the same place in the same position. I don't even say anything this time. I just speed walk back to the head of the train. The next day, I'm taking a train back home during the day. I'm paying special attention to this house as we go by it. There's nothing there. The drive isn't shoveled. Nothing is there that could have been mistaken for a guy in a trench coat. I have since been by this house dozens of times, and I have never seen a car parked there, or a light on, or anything at all. My uncle's best friend was a conductor/engineer for a train years ago. He told me that one night he was going up through North Florida and saw some deer on the tracks, so he lays on the horn to scare them off. All but one ran off the tracks. The last one ran in front of the train, along the tracks. He had to try to slow the train slightly to keep from running the deer over, but couldn't. The train caught up with the deer and he lost sight of it, believing that he had just run it over. When he got to the next city and slowed down for a turn, he noticed something on the side of the engine. He leaned out to see a deer laying on a set of steps just out of the view from his seat. It ended up jumping off in the middle of the city, a few hundred miles from its home. I'm an engineer now, but as a conductor, I was walking my train one midnight, lacing air hoses, getting the car's freight ready to pull. I noticed what I thought was a dog or a coyote about 100 yards away. No big deal. I have a big aluminum and steel stick with a hook for cranking brakes without having to climb onto the cars. Then I notice it kind of tracing along, pacing me. I could see the glow of its eyes watching me. Later, as we're ready to depart, I'm out in front of the engine, opening the track switch to get onto the main line. I'm in the engine's headlights, and I hear my engineer say quietly over the radio, "Calmly walk up to the engine. If I blow the whistle, run." I'm thinking, oh geez, it's just that coyote. No big deal. And I keep working. But he starts flashing the cab lights. So I think maybe there's a manager stalking us. So I go up there. He has me close the nose door and points out a giant mountain lion perched up on the berm 20 feet from where I was, casually sprawled out staring dead at us. This was northern Iowa, so pretty uncommon. That and a bunch of junkies and drunks around the yards. I'm not a conductor myself, but my commute to my campus is a 2-lane highway that runs parallel to a train track, and it has one crossing where the road and the track meet at an angle that basically forms a really squished X shape. One night, me and my cousin were carpooling back home from a midterm, and we were both pretty tired, a combination of exhaustion from those stressful midterms and the obvious weariness from late-night drives. We were just doing our normal drive home when we were about to hit the railroad crossing. From a distance, I noticed that there was an unusually bright light oncoming from the railroad track, but considering that the crossing lights weren't blaring and the arms weren't coming down, I figured that it was just a maintenance truck that was inspecting the track at night when it wouldn't be too busy. So I kept driving, considering there's no real reason to stop. In my mind, the railroad lights would be flashing red if there was really a train coming through. But as we drew closer, it became more and more apparent that these headlights were moving real fast and didn't have the intent of stopping. That's when we heard a large horn blare at us from the tracks. And with that, I slammed the brakes and stopped just a few feet away from a one-way train ride to purgatory. Me and my cousin nearly crapped ourselves that night. We spent the rest of the drive arguing over whether the lights were on, and we didn't notice them because we were tired, or if it was just a bad driver. The crazy thing is, when we're driving back the next morning, there was a crazy traffic accident at the highway that caused massive buildup. It turned out that a car performed a sudden brake in front of the railroad crossing and caused the 4 cars behind it to rear-end one another. The local radio station was reporting on the accident, and it was revealed that the lead driver slammed the brakes when he noticed a train about to use the railroad crossing, even though the crossing arms were still up and the lights weren't going off. Luckily, no one was severely injured. Okay, so I used to be a driver who was a third-party contractor who picked up and dropped off engineers/conductors when they timed out. Sometimes they would time out at the most inconvenient locations, and I would have to go pick them up, and a coworker in a different city would drop them off a replacement. Well, I received a call at 8 p.m. that I was going to pick someone up at 11 p.m. at a location in the Sierra Mountains. On my way, I was cruising down the main freeway, exited off a junction onto a 2-way highway. Using the Google Maps, my location I typed was not on a main road. Stress kicked in as I was going to have to take a dirt road in the mountains with fading cell phone service and would have to navigate in the dark. My radio worked and was the best line of communication to the train. Well, as I was traveling down a dirt road at 10:30 at night, something hit the top of my vehicle. I slowed down, locking my doors, and stopped. What the heck was that? I looked around and saw nothing. The road I was on had dense trees, a foot of clearance on each side of the vehicle, and the path didn't seem to be traveled much as plants were growing in the middle of the road path. I decided to crawl over my seats to look back, as no way in heck am I opening the doors. Nothing. I pause and stare quietly, waiting to see if anything moves. My radio was on, and the conductor asked if I was on the line, or there. I quickly realized it was the locomotive I was going to meet, and responded that I was on the way and on the dirt road heading towards them. They quickly responded with, "You made sure you took the first right off the highway, right?" I stated yes. He then stated, "But you kept going?" I stated yes. Now I'm frustrated because I'm thinking I traveled more than I needed to. Then, out of the corner of my eye, on the driver's side window, two big eyes reflecting light from my headlights are deadlocked on me. Oh crap. As my heart drops, adrenaline hit me, but I have no idea if it sees me through the tinted windows. I don't dare move. The eyes were large and seemed to be tracking after staring for a moment, which seemed like at me. The scary part was, I never saw what it was. The eyes were spaced and looking forward enough to be a bear, but moved as though it was much taller and smooth motion as if they were floating. When the animal moved, I could hear it push through all the foliage. When the eyes disappear, I pulled forward to a point that I could turn around, maybe a football field length away, and noticed as I was turning around, there were train tracks. The guy on the radio said stay there as they could see me. Well, short ending, the engineers hopped in, and on the way home were talking about how they saw a large animal that looked like the size of a bear that stood in front of their tracks as they were slowly coming to a stop, but took off much too fast to be a bear, and they even joked that it ran away on two legs at that speed. They said exactly where I saw the creature, and shivers to this day still happen when I think about it. Train engineer here. Nothing scary or strange, just a weird experience. I was coming into a stop at a platform after a long straight. All of a sudden, I see something small in the middle of the tracks. I slam the emergency brakes, and when I get closer, I see that it's a small dog without a leash, something the size of a Jack Russell. Clearly, it had run away from its owner. As I spot on the platform a panicking woman running after the dog on the platform. The dog was running straight at my train barking. My thoughts were, crap, I'm gonna kill someone's pet. And the dog disappeared from my sight. I almost couldn't stomach it, but I had to go out and look what happened. Turned out, the little rat was so little that he passed underneath the train. In the other end of the train, the dog's owner was there, and the dog, which had miraculously passed underneath the entire train without getting hit by the undercarriage. Poor thing was probably traumatized, but luckily, he survived. Okay, so it wasn't me driving the train but one of my coworkers. It was early in the morning, and he called up that a lady has just fell in front of his train and has gone under. Emergency services are called, and when they arrive, they cannot find a person or any parts of a person. No sign whatsoever of a fatality or anything. Police do a search of the area and find the lady matching the description of the person that went under the train. Apparently, she was a sleepwalker and left home on one of her walks. Train footage shows her while walking through a pedestrian maze at a crossing. She appeared to trip and fall between the tracks, and under it just as the train passed over her. When the train comes to a stop, she casually rolls out from under the train and continues on her morning walk. For the weekend, I wanted to visit my boyfriend. He lives 2 hours away and I always go by train. I'm not easily spooked, but I always keep an eye out. A girl's gotta do what a girl's gotta do, am I right? 1 hour into the trip, it was around 8 o'clock p.m. I see two men getting into the same train compartment as me. I was sitting in a two-seat. The seat next to me was empty, and in front of me there was a seat for 4 people. So 2 pairs of seats facing each other. The men came in being very loud, even though it was a silent compartment. But nobody said anything, because they already seemed very suspicious. From the moment they stepped into the train, probably before they got in, they had their eyes fixated on me. They stepped in through the doors and sat in the seat in front of me, the 4th seat. And from then on, they kept an eye on me, while discussing things with each other in a language that I did not understand. Like every other girl, I get stared at frequently, especially when I wear my hair down. It normally makes me feel a bit awkward, but I never feel unsafe when this happens. Until yesterday. But they were staring at me in every way possible. Through the chairs, standing up, sitting down, and bending over to get a good look. Through the reflection of the mirror, and by getting up and walking past me. They were taking turns and walking over to the other compartment of the train. The other compartment was only separated from mine with a glass door. Every time one of them got up, they both started staring at me. Then one of them went away, and the other one had clear vision of me and kept staring at me. He poked his head through the middle of the seats and offered me chocolate, which I politely refused. Then the other one came back, and 5 minutes later, the man who did not go away yet went away in the same way. They kept taking turns in walking away, and every time one of them got up, the one who remained seated kept an eye on the other, and on me. Each time they were sitting across from each other, they discussed things, but I could not translate it. They kept looking at me, and then started discussing again. When I had 20 minutes of my trip left, a lot of people got out at one stop. It was just me, them, and one other male. The moment the doors were about to close, one of the creepy men started walking through the doors to check if there were people coming in, and maybe to check if there was security. I don't know why he did it, but when he came back, he scanned the train to see how many people were still on there. From that moment on, they both got in seats facing me. They would not stop staring at this point. As you can imagine, I panicked and was stressed out. So I slowly turned around to look behind the glass doors to see if there were more people there that could maybe help me. And to my luck, there were more people there. So I slowly and very softly put on my jacket. We still had more than 10 minutes left then. And I kid you not even 2 minutes later, one of the men starts getting dressed too. He took his purse and his jacket and kept looking at me and fixating on me while still discussing with the other man. This was where I really panicked. I already let my friends know what was going on, and my boyfriend was already at the train stop where I was supposed to get out. Then I contemplated what the smartest thing to do was, because there's an emergency number on the train that you can call or text if you feel unsafe. But I had a gut feeling that this would not help me. So I got my bags, got up and walked through the glass doors to the other compartment. I sat facing them so that I could see what they were doing. They both got up and grabbed their bags and started walking towards me. Mind you, they were sitting closest to the exit, so there was absolutely no reason for them to take this route too. I rapidly start to walk to someone on the next seats in front of mine and asked if he could help me, because I was getting followed and watched by 2 grown men. He said he also thought that they were very suspicious and was getting scared for me. He asked me to sit next to him so he could help keep me a little bit safer and distract the men or something. Then he distracted me a little bit and asked me questions about my life. When the 2 creeps saw that I got seated next to the man, they were already coming my way and were making their way through the doors of the compartment. They're glass doors, so we could see each other very clearly. I had not shown my fear, but I was shaking so uncontrollably that they must have seen how scared I was. The moment they got through that door, they saw me getting seated next to the other man, and the creeps exchanged looks. Looked at me, discussed something, looked at me again, turned around and went the other way. They were walking to the exit of the train, where again there's a glass door, so we could still see each other. The whole time they were standing around the exit, they were looking at me with a very creepy and disturbed look on their faces. I describe it as, you got away, but you won't be that lucky next time. That's how it felt. The man I was sitting next to also got the hang of this, and was calming me down. He told me that he was not going to let me get off this train by myself, and would wait with me until my boyfriend would arrive. That was amazing, and I felt so comforted. But then our stop came, and we walked to our side of the exit, and then came a realization. In the exit of the train, there were standing 2 other men with the exact same kind of looks as the 2 creeps. They talked the same language, and they acted weird too. These men were probably the men who the 2 creeps visited every few minutes. The men at the exit saw me, looked at me with a creepy look, but then the man who kept me safe made sure to them that he walked with me, and immediately they looked away. They also covered their face with their hoods. The doors opened, and they nearly sprinted out of there, just as the 2 other creeps. Then the man who escorted me out waited with me until we found my boyfriend, and then he went on his way. We both could not thank him enough for keeping me safe. I thought I lived in a very safe country in Europe, but I think that as long as you're a young woman on your own, you will never be 100% safe while traveling or being alone. I hate thinking about what would have happened if I was not helped by the man in the other department. I wish I could have thanked him with gifts or a nice gesture, but I don't know his name, and I'll probably never see him again. To the man who saved me, I thank you with all of my heart. That was a very long story, but in real time, this only lasted about an hour. I hope people read this, and I really hope that you all stay safe. Just be on the lookout for each other, and help someone when you can. Thanks for reading. It was probably around January 2018 at the time. I had to take the 8 a.m. train once a month to see my boyfriend, and usually took the 6 p.m. train to go home. As I enter the 6 p.m. train, I see a man kissing, licking, and making out with the train window. He seemed as surprised as I was and quickly stopped when he saw me. I didn't think too much of it, so I didn't change cars, but simply went upstairs to sit. It was a 2-floor train. I was playing on my phone, not paying attention to anything else, which wasn't a clever move because it was dark outside. And when it's dark outside, the station just before mine can be easily mistaken for mine. So I look outside, see the train stopped, and see this station that looks exactly like mine. So I run outside thinking it was my stop. Once out, I quickly noticed that it wasn't. I once again mistook the other station for mine. So as I casually went back in, I saw the window-looking guy that was now a couple of meters away from me, sprinting back to his seat. I wonder why for a minute, then it clicked. This guy tried to follow me outside, but backed off once he saw that I was coming back in. Only there did I change cars, because I was starting to get creeped out. And when I got out at my station, the real one this time, I was searching for him, wondering if it was just a coincidence, and that maybe he freaked out because he mistook the precedent station for his too. But nope. Luckily, he stayed in the train. My boyfriend at the time and I lived in different towns, so I had to take a train to go see him. I arrived early like I normally do, and this man is sat down next to me. I didn't think anything of it until he started talking to me. "Where you heading to?" he asked me, which I proceed to tell the man that I'm off to see my boyfriend, who is currently waiting for me. He smiles. He decided to tell me how we'd make a great family together, how he can be an uncle to me. I found that weird. He then hugged me, which I didn't know what to do. He said he knew me. I asked him how. He proceeded to tell me where I worked out. My job was me dressing up in costumes that contains putting a head on so you couldn't see who I was. The only time I ever took the head off is where I had to get completely undressed. I found this weird. He said he remembered me being much thinner, but I know that he meant my sister who also works the same job as me. My train arrived and I go inside, and he decided to sit next to me. Before we sat down, he wanted a hug, and when I gave him a hug, I looked at the woman behind me and mouthed the word "help me." She hadn't responded. I sat down and he proceeded to kiss at my neck and I pushed him away. He got upset and I quickly got off at the next stop. I had to board another train and ended up telling the police of what happened. They tried their best to find him, but sadly they couldn't. Ever since, I felt completely uncomfortable at my job. This was a number of years ago now. One morning, I was waiting at my local train station for a train to uni. Out of the corner of my eye, I could swear there was someone staring at me. I turned to look, and there was this lady, no younger than 60, just staring at me with wide eyes. She stared at me the whole time, didn't even look away when I looked at her, just kept staring. A train came and I went to get on, and the lady follows me. I tried to trick her to see if she would keep following me. So, just as I went to the door of the carriage, I instead turned left and got on the next carriage. Yep, she followed me there. She then sat in the aisle opposite me and continually looked over at me. She then got off 2 stations later. A few days later, I see her again. Same thing. Stares at me, follows me onto the train, continues staring, gets off 2 stations later. About a week or so later, on a weekend, I was taking a train with my mother. We sat on the bench on the opposite side of the platform to where I had been previously. Train station was almost empty. And who comes to sit right next to my mom? Yep, that old lady. Keeps looking over at me and my mother, and does a similar thing on the train as well. I haven't seen her since. Last November, my brother was visiting us from Dundee with his 3-year-old son. Since my brother had moved from Glasgow, we didn't get to see him or his family too often, so we cherished it any time we got to see them. His wife unfortunately could not travel down due to work, and only a day into his visit, he was called back to himself for an emergency. His nephew wanted to stay, as we had brought him tickets to the football game the day after. So I agreed to take him back to his dad in Dundee after the game. The only train that I could get was a fairly late one, and it was therefore the last one of the day. So I took my nephew to the football game and headed straight to the station afterwards. The train was fairly busy, but I had booked us 2 seats. Just as we were about to board the train, the man standing next to me made an odd comment. "Like sardines, aren't they? I hate sardines," he said. I found this fairly odd and just laughed it off awkwardly. I've never been good at making conversations with strangers and always felt uneasy when one approaches me. As we made our way to our seats, I noticed an old couple sitting in them. I told them it was our seats, but they were fairly rude and told me that people shouldn't be made to stand for a journey. I always hate confrontation, especially in public, so I just left. There were no 2 seats together anywhere on the train, so me and my nephew were forced to stand for about an hour until many people on the train finally got off when it stopped in Perth. Me and my nephew sat down, and I mistakenly fell asleep as I was so tired after a fairly long day and standing for an hour on the train. As my nephew was only 3, he obviously fell asleep as well. I awoke just as the last passengers were getting off at Dundee. I quickly jumped up and tried to get my nephew off the train as quickly as possible, but he was too slow and I had to stay on the train with him, meaning that we missed the stop. As the train was delayed slightly, It was now going straight to Aberdeen, which was about another hour or so away. I sat down and tried to phone anyone I knew, but I didn't have any signal. I began to panic, as I knew that there would be no return trains from Aberdeen at this time of night, likely meaning that I would have to stay the night there in a hotel. I tried to compose myself and looked about the train to see if there was anyone who could maybe help me. My carriage had more or less cleared out by this point, and there was only 3 other people left. An older woman sleeping a few rows in front of me, a young man reading a book at the opposite side, and a third man behind me. I told my nephew to go back to sleep and started trying to plan what I would do when we had gotten to Aberdeen. As my phone had no signal, this was obviously fairly difficult, and thought that I would ask the man behind me for any help. I looked in the window's reflection at him, and noticed it was the same man who had made the sardine comment earlier. He was a middle-aged man, fairly average build and height, and there was nothing to suggest that he was in any way dangerous. Except one thing. He was staring right at me. I looked away for a minute, thinking maybe he was just looking about the train as I did only a moment ago. But when I looked again, he was still staring. His stare didn't seem to break until he got up to presumably go to the toilet. I debated switching to another carriage, but before I could gather my stuff and wake my nephew, he returned. Only this time, he sat in a different seat, facing me directly. A few uneasy moments before he made his first comment. "Someone's sleepy," he said, nodding to my nephew. I laughed awkwardly and put my earphones in to avoid having to talk to him, even though my phone had just died. "Must be some set of earphones if they can listen to music when your phone's dead," he said. My heart dropped. "I'm only kidding you on," he said, but I now had no excuse to avoid conversation with him. "So are you going home or visiting someone?" he asked. I made the mistake of telling him what had happened, and that I had missed my stop. "That's quite the situation. You won't get a train back at this time." I nodded and said I'll just find a hotel for the night. He then approached my seat and sat across from me. "Hotels will all be booked out, and even if they aren't, they'll charge you a fortune. I've got a place not far from the station. You can stay there for the night and get the train in the morning. I'll stay out of the way of you and your son, don't worry." I explained to the man that it was not my son, and that I was happy to cough up the money for a hotel, and tried to stay polite by saying that I didn't want to be a nuisance for him, even though I really just wanted to tell him to leave me alone. "Oh, believe me, you won't be any nuisance to me," he said in an overly friendly tone. I was now feeling extremely unnerved, but still tried my best to talk myself out of the situation. This conversation carried on for another 10 minutes or so, and he was increasingly insistent that I stayed with him. I didn't have any idea of what to do. I felt completely helpless. I told him I needed the toilet in an effort to get away from the carriage. This is when he grabbed my wrist below the table. "You're not going anywhere," he said in a hushed tone. "You're staying with me. I'll keep you safe," he said in an extremely chilling voice. I couldn't even bring myself to scream out in the situation. The only other passengers in the carriage were at the opposite end, and I was so terrified that if I screamed, the man would hurt me or my nephew. He wouldn't let go of my wrist, and repeatedly began saying, "Just act natural." The remaining part of the journey seemed to last a lifetime, and I knew even then and there was no light at the end of this tunnel, as this man would not let me go. The train finally reached Aberdeen, and the man told me to wake my nephew, not to alarm him, and tell him that we're staying at this nice man's house for the evening. He held my hand as we got off the train. My worst feelings were coming true, as I knew that that would happen when this man got us back to his house. All of a sudden, I was knocked to the floor in a heap of bodies. The police had tackled the man and were arresting him. As I got to my feet, I grabbed my nephew's hand and ran only a couple of yards before completely breaking down. The police comforted me and told me that the young man who was reading his book at the other side of the carriage had noticed what was going on and sent a text to the British Transport Police, whose number is all over the walls of the train on posters. It took me a couple of minutes to process everything, but I managed to gain enough composure to thank the police and express my gratitude towards the man who had sent the text. I only managed to say a few words to him, but I will be forever grateful to him, as he saved me from what would have been a night of terror, and very possibly saved me and my nephew's life. The police very kindly took me and my nephew back to Dundee, where my brother and his wife were extremely relieved to see us. It is now some time since the incident, but it's had a lasting effect on me, and I always make sure that when I'm traveling late at night, that I am accompanied by someone, and never run the risk of missing my stop ever again. This happened last year in summer, maybe at the beginning of June, and I was 17. I was on my way to get some camp leader training for volunteering abroad. I'm not very talkative with strangers. It takes some time for me to open up, and I thought that I'd get out of my comfort zone and learn something new. It was really hot outside. I had at least 3 hours of traveling by buses and trains. Once I got to the capital, I traveled by train. It was packed, so I couldn't sit down anywhere but by the door on the steps. I sat down and plugged my headphones in, and then a man walked in and sat down uncomfortably close. I couldn't move anywhere. Out of nowhere, he starts talking to me, and I pretend not to hear him while I look out the little window. But he taps my shoulder, and I'm really nervous and polite, so I take out one of my headphones, hoping that he just wants to know where his stop is. So I hear out what he has to say. He asked me what I was listening to. At this point, I can hear that he's kind of slurring his words, and his eyes are a little red and glossy. I don't think he had a face mask on either. I kind of nervously shrugged my shoulders and did the eye smile at him. He was trying to do small talk with me, but I wasn't really listening, just nodding, wondering how long that I'd have to stay on this train. He constantly tried to get me to talk and answer to everything he said. His tone got a bit passive-aggressive a few times, so I was scared not to answer. At one point, a man walked past us to use the toilet. I tried to give him a pleading look, but they greeted each other as if they were buddies. That man probably didn't have a ticket, because he stayed there the whole time I was on the train. After a while, he got back to my music, and said that we should just pick our favorite song and give them to each other to listen to them. I was creeped the heck out, so I did that. Then the chair hit the fan. He said, "Why don't you take your mask off? I bet you're pretty." I was shaking, and then he extended his hand towards me and tried to take my mask off. I literally put my hand in a cross gesture to protect myself and said no. This is where he should have realized that I was uncomfy, but surprise, surprise, he didn't. I don't know what he was thinking. I'm a nervous smiler, so I just chuckled very uncomfortably. And he tried this multiple times after that. I kept doing the crossed wrists gesture to protect myself and saying no each time. Then he asked me to guess his age. I did. He said he was 36, asked me and I said 16, hoping that he would shut up or at least tone it down. But no. He got closer and examined the sleeve of my shirt, saying it's nice. I was almost so scared that I was peeing myself at this point. And then a conductor walks to us. Thank God. Or not. Because when I looked at him, almost tearing up, he ignored me and walked away. Then this dude playfully nudges the side of my thigh, while still complimenting me and trying to get me to take my mask off. Then he gets up to get a cigarette and walks into the toilet to the second dude. He told me to let him know when I was getting off. Earlier, he told me he was going somewhere further, and I convinced him that I was going home and my parents were waiting for me, because I heard that should make them not follow you or something like that. He wasn't intimidated at all. Heck no. As soon as he got into the bathroom, I grabbed my bags, walked 2 wagons away from the one that I was in, and finally took a few breaths while people looked at me weird. I must have looked like a mess. When the train arrived at my stop, I booked it and kept looking over my shoulder at the train station, as well as walking down a street. I decided to change into my long hoodie in case he was somewhere behind me. Luckily, he didn't follow me. I called one of my parents on the way to my final destination, absolutely out of breath. My other parent called me later, assuring that I was all right, and I haven't told about it to any of the leaders at the event. I don't know what would have happened if he didn't go for that smoke. but I'm certainly glad that he was stupid enough to hope that I'd let him know when I was getting off. Writing this or talking about it makes me feel like I'm there on that train again. And the worst thing is, so many people I know have similar experiences. Why do some people have to be so creepy? In short, a possibly drunk creep tried to take off my mask in a crowded train multiple times, nudged me, and told me to let him know when I was getting off so that he could probably come with me. He went to smoke on the toilet and I ran off, and thankfully never saw him again. This all happened a few years back, around when I was in 8th or 9th grade, so things are a bit blurry, but I'm trying to recall this as best as I can. It was a sunny Monday afternoon. On Monday, I went to my piano lessons directly after school, one train station away from the bus stop I used. So after my lesson was over, I was waiting for the train at the train station. I used to walk in circles or up and down while I'm waiting to pass the time. This time, I noticed a guy watching me, probably Arabic or Turkish, definitely foreign. He couldn't speak German. Yes, I'm German. Anyways, I noticed him and looked up. He smiled at me and waved. I brushed it off and thought nothing of it at first. The train came and I entered, sat down and did what I usually do when going my train. I was wearing headphones, but I did see the guy again. He was in the same wagon as me, looking over, still smiling. One station later, I left the train and went for the bus stop, starting to feel uneasy. I noticed the guy was following me and getting on the same bus as me. There are 3 different buses going from the stop, and mine is going to a rather quiet part of town. The bus wasn't overly full, and I was sitting in front. I internally hoped that this dude wouldn't get off the bus at the same stop as I did, but my hopes were quickly shattered, because that's exactly what he did. I got off the bus as quickly as I could, crossed the street and looked back, slightly panicking when I saw the guy following me. Still, I tried ignoring him and hide underneath my headphones when he caught up to me and started speaking to me. He asked me what I was listening to. I wondered why some random stranger would care about what I listened to, but I tried to be polite and handed him my headphones to listen. Feel Invincible by Skillet, in case anyone wants to know. Anyways, I took them back after some seconds, and this stranger started complimenting me, telling me I was pretty and everything like that, and all I could think of was getting the heck away from there. So I asked him why he was following me and what he wanted. He was only able to speak English. The short conversation went as follows. Me: I'm sorry, but why are you following me? Do you need something? Him: I don't know where a certain grocery store here in Germany, I won't mention the name, is. Could you tell me? It's between the train station and the primary school at such and such street. You actually should have seen it while on the bus because we went past it. You need to take the bus back to the train station. From there. I pointed to the direction of the opposite side bus stop. Him: thank you. Then this dude proceeded to hug me. I was having my heavy school bag on my back, so that worked rather bad than well. But every single alarm bell in my head went off. I was literally frozen solid. But when he tried to kiss me, I pushed him away and told him I had to go home. Now. And with that, I ran. I looked back for a second and breathed out in relief when I saw him going back to the bus stop. But yet, I didn't stop running until I was home. I told my mom what had happened, and she then kept picking me up late at night when I was returning home from training. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Have a great night, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.